In the Arizona Territory in the summer of 1887, a young woman stood alone on a dry flat 12 miles from the nearest water, driving a surveyor's rod into soil that had not been broken in 3 years. Her name was Maren Cole. She was 26 years old. She had $11 in her coat pocket. $11 she had paid 3 weeks earlier for 4 acres of cracked alkaline scrub that no one in the territory wanted. Every man at the land auction had watched her raise her hand and laughed quietly into their beards. The auctioneer had not bothered to wait for a competing bid. What Maren knew, and none of them did, was that the ground beneath her feet was not empty. Something was down there. Something heavy, something sealed, something that a powerful man had gone to considerable trouble to put out of reach before the wrong pair of eyes could find it. Maren's father had spent the last months of his life trying to locate it. He had not succeeded, but he had left her his notebooks, his transit scope, and the particular kind of training that teaches a person to read a landscape the way most people read a ledger. Alert to what is missing, to what does not add up, to the gap between what a thing looks like and what it actually is. If you have ever stood in a desert and felt that the ground beneath you holds something it has not given back, stay with this story. Because what Maren Cole found at Aldrin Flat in the summer of 1887, it was the answer to a question her father had died asking. Edmund Cole had been a bank examiner for the territorial government since 1879. He was not a dramatic man. He wore spectacles that were always slightly wrong for his face, kept his notebooks in a brown canvas satchel he had owned since the war, and he believed with a patience that bordered on faith that every falsified ledger eventually said so if you read it carefully enough. He had trained Maren to use a transit scope when she was 12, not because he expected her to become a surveyor, but because he believed that learning to measure a thing precisely was the foundation of learning to think. She had carried that discipline the way other daughters carry their mother's china, carefully and without resentment. In the fall of 1884, Edmund Cole had been assigned to examine the books of the Meridian Land and Trust Company, a small territorial bank headquartered in the town of Aldrin Flat in the desert east of Yuma. Meridian had closed its doors 3 months earlier, citing insolvency. Its principal partner was a man named Hollis Vane, who had by then already departed Aldrin Flat and established himself in Tucson as a territorial land commissioner. The closure of a small frontier bank was not unusual. Dozens had folded in those years, caught between the optimism of the mining boom and the arithmetic of its collapse. Edmund Cole had examined 3 others that same autumn. What made Meridian different was a column in the transfer register that did not balance. Not by a dramatic sum, not by the kind of number that announces itself, by $432 across 18 months of entries in a pattern so incremental and so carefully distributed across accounts that it would have passed unnoticed by anyone who was not looking for exactly that kind of patient. Edmund Cole had been looking for exactly that kind of patience for 30 years. The pattern, once he saw it, revealed a systematic transfer of depositor funds across 11 accounts held by 3 mining cooperatives operating in the territory east of Yuma. The funds had not been lost to bad loans or failed speculation. They had been moved in amounts small enough to be absorbed by the noise of ordinary banking error to an account with no named beneficiary and a routing designation Edmund Cole had never encountered before. The amounts ranged from $31 to $214 per entry, and none of them fell on the same day of the month, twice in succession, which told him the person who designed the scheme had thought carefully about the difference between a pattern. A pattern can be found. A habit is found faster. Whoever had constructed these transfers had made sure they looked, on any individual examination, like rounding corrections and posting delays and the routine imprecision of a small territorial bank. whose ledger keeper was not entirely careful. Taken individually, they were nothing. Taken across 18 months, they were a systematic evacuation of 3 accounts that had never complained, because the men who held them had trusted the institution and had been watching their mining claims, not their deposit slips. He had spent 6 weeks tracing the routing chain before it ended at a Meridian subsidiary that existed, as far as the territorial record showed, only on paper. The subsidiary was called Basin Resource Holdings. It had a charter number and a filing date, and nothing beyond that. No officers, no address, no history of activity, beyond the receipt of deposits routed from within Meridian. He estimated the total theft at somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000. He wrote this in his notebook, in his careful, near-handless script, with 3 asterisks beside it and a date. He was found dead on the road between Aldrin Flat and Yuma in October of 1884. The territorial government recorded the cause as exposure. His horse had thrown him, they said, and he had not been found in time. His brown canvas satchel was missing. Marin had been 23 years old. She had not believed the ruling then, and she did not believe it 3 years later. What she had was her memory of her father's last letter to her, written 10 days before his death, in which he told her that the thing he had found was not in the books. The books, rather, had been altered to remove it. The physical record, he wrote, had been placed somewhere. It would not be found. He did not say where. He wrote that he intended to determine the location before he reported to the territorial office, because without the physical record, his findings were an examiner's opinion against a land commissioner's word, and he knew which one a territorial court would credit. He had not determined it in time. Marin had spent the 3 years since doing what her father had taught her to do. She had read the landscape for what was missing. She began with the territorial land records for the Aldrin Flat parcel, which she obtained from the Yuma Land Office in the spring of 1887. The parcel had been transferred to a holding company called Alkali Basin Holdings in December of 1884, 6 weeks after his death. Alkali Basin Holdings existed only on paper. Its registered agent was a Tucson law firm with 3 named clients: Hollis Vane, a land speculator named Doyle, and a railway surveying concern that had folded in 1882. The transfer price was $1. A parcel of desert scrub transferred for $1 in December, 6 weeks after a bank examiner died on a road 12 miles away, to a holding company controlled by the man that examiner had been investigating. Marin set the record down on the table in the Yuma Land Office and looked at it for a long time. She did not accuse anyone. She asked the clerk if the parcel had ever been assessed for mineral content. He told her. She asked if there was a survey on file. He said there was one from 1878, which she read and found unremarkable. She thanked him, paid the filing fee, and walked to the telegraph office to send a letter to the Yuma Territorial Land Auction Board, advising them that she wished to file on Aldrin Flat as an unimproved desert parcel at the minimum statutory price. 3 weeks later, standing at the auction lectern, she raised her hand once, and no one raised it back. A week after she took possession, she left Yuma on a rented wagon with her father's transit scope, his level rod, his notebooks, and 4 days of water. The road east from Yuma into the desert basin was not much of a road. It was 2 ruts cut by freight wagons in a wetter year, bordered by brittle bush and creosote, and further east by a low ridge of eroded sandstone that held the color of old rust in the afternoon light. Marin drove with one hand and held her father's notebook open, against her knee with the other, rereading his survey notes from his 1884 examination of the Aldrin Flat site. He had been to the site twice that autumn. The second visit, 11 days before his death, was recorded in a different pencil than the first, pressed harder against the page. as though he had been writing in poor light or in a hurry. He had noted a depression in the alkaline flat, roughly 20 feet by 30, that did not correspond to any natural feature of the surrounding soil. He had noted that the soil in the depression was marginally darker than the surrounding crust, which in alkaline desert indicated recently disturbed material. He had sketched a compass bearing from the collapsed foundations of the Meridian Bank building, the only standing structure on the flat, at south-southwest, 41 degrees, and a distance of approximately 60 yards. Marin had read that entry so many times in 3 years that she could recite it from memory. She was reading it again now because she had begun to understand something her father had not written down, only implied. Whatever was buried at that bearing and distance was buried to be retrievable, not thrown in a canyon or dropped in a river. Buried with care, in a specific location, with a bearing someone could follow. Someone had meant to come back for it. The town of Aldrin Flat had been uninhabited for 3 years. What remained of it was the Meridian Bank building's stone foundation, a collapsed livery stable, and 4 adobe walls that had once been a hotel. The hotel's roof had come down in sections, the vigas rotted through, and the plaster of the ceiling dropped in large, pale plates across the floor, and birds had nested in the window openings and departed, and the nests were empty now, stiff with age. The flat itself was wide and shadowless in the afternoon, the soil pale and cracked into hexagonal plates, the air tasting of alkali and heat. A roadrunner crossed in front of her wagon and did not hurry. Somewhere to the south, a hawk traced a slow circle above the ridge. The silence was absolute. She unhitched the wagon and watered the horse from a canvas bucket, watching the flat while the animal drank. The Meridian Bank building's foundation was the most solid surviving structure, which was why her father had chosen it as his instrument station. She could see the logic from here. The stone was level and dry, the sight line to the flat unobstructed, and the compass bearing he had recorded would have been taken from the foundation's northeast corner, which she could identify by the iron anchor bolt still set in the stone where the doorframe had been mortised. She had read that note so many times she could reconstruct his posture from it. Marin set up her father's transit scope on the bank foundation, which gave her a stable flat surface and a clear sight line across the flat. She took the bearing from his notebook, set the instrument, sighted through the eyepiece, and walked the rod. The depression was still there. Smaller than 3 years of wind and rain had left it in her imagination, but unmistakable once she knew to look. A subtle convexity rose in the alkaline crust, where something large and rigid had resisted the settling of the surrounding soil. The ground above it had not sunk at the same rate as the ground around it, because the thing beneath had held its shape. She circled it twice on foot before she stood on its edge, measuring her estimate of its dimensions against the vault's known footprint from her father's notation. The dimensions aligned. She drove her iron rod into the ground. At 8 inches, it struck something that rang. It rang. She stood for a moment with the rod in both hands, and the desert quiet around her, and felt the thing her father had felt. She was certain of it standing at this same spot 3 years ago. The ground was not empty, and that what was beneath her feet was not going to come up easily. She pulled the rod clear and crouched to examine the hole it left. The soil was gray-white alkaline crust for the first 3 inches, then gray clay beneath, then, just visible at the rod's penetration depth, a gleam of iron oxide red, the characteristic rust color of coated iron that has spent time in damp soil. Not long enough and not damp enough to compromise the structure. Just enough to tell her it was there. She camped that night beside the wagon. The desert at night was cold and enormous, the stars pressing down against the ridge to the south, the flat, a pale plain of nothing in every direction. She built no fire, there being nothing to burn, and ate cold biscuits and drank water sparingly, and read her father's notebooks until she could no longer see the page. His note on the Meridian vault was in the margin of a page dated September of 1884, when he had visited the bank building before its contents were dispersed. He had catalogued the vault, noting it as a Herring Hall Marvin model, ironclad, double lock, with a number plate indicating manufacture in Cincinnati in 1879. He had noted the lock mechanism in detail because he was thorough about everything, not because he had suspected then that the vault itself would matter. The key entry was on a separate line, underlined. Transport weight approximately 3,000 pounds without contents. 3,000 pounds. Marin had thought about that weight for 3 years, about what it would take to move it. About who, in October of 1884, would have had access to the equipment required and the motive to use it. She found the answer the next morning in the person of Rufus Hatch. Rufus Hatch was a teamster, 61 years old, who had worked the freight routes east of Yuma since before the war. He lived now in a small stone house at the junction where the Aldrin Road met the main Yuma Freight Road, 12 miles west of the flat, and she had seen the smoke of his breakfast fire on her way out. She had not stopped then. She stopped on her way to fetch more water. He met her at the gate with the particular wariness of a man who had been watching a woman drive alone into the desert and had been waiting for her to come back. He was lean and brown, with the kind of hands that had spent 40 years managing teams in the heat, the skin the color of old harness leather, every knuckle enlarged. He looked at her father's transit scope in the wagon bed, and then looked at her face, and seemed to reach some private conclusion. She asked him whether he had ever worked freight for the Meridian Bank before it closed. He said he had. He had hauled their deposits twice, the first time with another man, the second alone. She asked whether he had ever hauled a load from Aldrin Flat at night. He was quiet for a long moment. The desert behind him was very still. A horse moved somewhere in his small corral, and the chain of its halter ticked against the post. Then he said, "Yes, once, in October of 1884. He had been hired by a man whose name he did not know, a large man in a good coat, hired through the Yuma Freight Office by letter, and paid in cash delivered in advance to the office clerk. He had been asked to bring his heaviest wagon and his 2 strongest mules to the Meridian Bank building at 10 o'clock at night, and to tell no one about the job. When he arrived, there were 4 other men already there, and the thing to be hauled was already outside the bank, covered in canvas and lashed to a timber frame. He could not see it clearly in the lantern light, but he could tell from how many men it had taken to move it that it was iron and very heavy. They had driven out to the flat by lantern light, arriving past midnight with no moon. The man ahead of him had marked the site earlier with a stake, and 2 of them set to work with long-handled shovels while the others waited. They had dug for nearly 2 hours. Then they had rigged a rope tackle to lower the vault down on its timber frame, and 4 of them had gone down into the hole with it to set it level. And they had come back up and filled the hole in stages, tamping the soil between each layer, and covered the disturbed surface with flat alkaline plates scraped from the surrounding ground, so it would not read fresh. They had not spoken much. He had been told not to speak of it. He had not spoken of it for 3 years, because no one had asked him directly, and because he had grown to feel that the asking would come eventually, and that he would know the right person when they arrived. He had recognized the transit scope in the wagon bed. He had seen the same model at survey stations when the railway came through. Marin said nothing for a moment. Then she asked him if he would be willing to sign a statement. He said, his voice flat and level, that he had been waiting to sign one since November of 1884. She was back at the flat by midday, with a second day's water, a borrowed spade, and the knowledge that she was not wrong. What she was not that afternoon was fast. The vault had been buried at a depth of 4 feet, and the alkaline soil above it had compacted over 3 years into something close to cement. She broke the surface crust with the spade's heel, working in long parallel rows to avoid losing the vault's edges, and found the resistance she expected at every strike. The sun was past its highest point, but still capable, and she worked in the shade of her own hat, taking water every quarter hour, resting when her hands went numb from the handle's vibration. By evening, she had cleared a trench 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep along the vault's north edge. The iron was visible. It had not rusted badly, protected by the dry alkalinity of the desert soil, and where the edge caught the last of the light, it was still dull black, still solid. She covered the trench with canvas and drove her tent stakes and slept. The second day was harder. The soil below the first 2 feet had not dried in 3 years and was still heavy clay, dense and pale gray, clinging to the spade with every lift. She had not anticipated how quickly her hands would blister in the dry air. The blisters formed and burst, and she wrapped each palm with strips of canvas from her survey kit and kept working. The excavation required her to stand in the trench beside the vault, which meant working in narrow quarters with the vault's iron wall inches from her shoulder, and the clay had to be thrown clear in small loads because there was no room to build a pile beside her. She threw it in arcs over the trench edge, rebuilding the pile she had begun the day before, and twice she had to stop and clear the pile back from the edge so it would not slide in. The sun came over the ridge at 7 in the morning and was on her without interruption until it touched the opposite ridge at 6. She worked in 3-hour intervals with water and rest between them, watching the vault wall emerge from the clay like a thing being born in reverse. She cleared the south wall of the vault in the morning and began on the face by noon. The vault's door was oriented north, toward the bearing she had followed from the foundation, which confirmed it had been set down deliberately rather than rolled in. Someone had planned for a person to stand in front of this door and open it. She had been thinking for 2 days about what kind of someone, and the answer had settled into something she recognized from her father's notes. Not a thief leaving forever, but a principal putting an asset temporarily beyond reach while the examination passed. Hollis Vane had expected to come back. He had not expected Edmund Cole to find the depression in the soil. By mid-afternoon of the second day, she had the vault fully exposed on 3 sides and was working to clear the face and the lock housing from packed clay. The face of the vault was its most finished surface. The iron cladding had been ground smooth and painted in the factory, and then lacquered, and the lacquer had held against the clay over 3 years better than she had expected. Say, the lock housing was centered, a 12-inch diameter recessed plate, with a combination wheel at the center and the key escutcheon below, and the clay had worked into every gap around the housing rim. She used a short-handled brush from her survey kit for the lock itself, working the clay from the housing plate with careful strokes, and found the plate clean and legible beneath. Herring Hall, Marvin, Cincinnati, 1879. The same number her father had written down. She pressed her thumb against the number plate and felt the embossed characters under her wrapped hand and stayed there for a moment, with the desert light slanting, long and orange across the flat behind her. She had his notes on the lock mechanism. It was a double lock model with a combination wheel and a key override. The key was not something she had. She had not expected to have it. The combination her father had written was set at the time of installation and was recorded in the bank's founding paperwork, which, along with the rest of Meridian's records, had been declared lost in the bank's closure. What her father had also noted in the same margin entry was that the Herring Hall Marvin 1879 model used a manufacturing standard combination for all units produced in that year for the convenience of bank examiners who needed access. The combination was not a secret. It was in the technical bulletin her father had filed with his survey notes, which he had kept in the brown canvas satchel that had gone missing from the road east of Yuma in October of 1884. Marin had found the satchel 2 years later in the storeroom of the Yuma Land Office, filed under a land commissioner's name and marked as recovered property. The satchel had been emptied of everything except the survey notes and the Herring Hall Marvin Technical Bulletin. Whoever had taken it had not understood what the bulletin was. She had understood. On the morning of the third day, she stood in front of the exposed vault door in the early desert light before the heat arrived, with the technical bulletin open in one hand and her father's transit scope case behind her in the wagon. She set the combination wheel per the bulletin's instructions. She felt the tumblers align one after another with the small sequential certainty of a thing correctly read. The door was heavy. 3 years of alkaline clay had worked into the hinge on the side she could not fully clear, and she needed the spade handle as a lever to break the seal, but it broke. The door swung outward on its hinges, slow and deliberate, and the air that came out of it was the air of October 1884, cold and paper dry. She did not rush. She stood and breathed that air for a moment and thought of her father. Then she looked inside. The vault contained no gold, no currency, no strongbox. The interior was smaller than she had imagined. The iron walls close and cold, the air that came out carrying the smell of dry cedar and old paper and something mineral she could not name. The vault floor was iron plate, and on it stood a single cedar case, sealed with brass clasps, resting on a low iron shelf, so that it would not sit in any groundwater that might have seeped in. Beside the case, wrapped in oilcloth tied with waxed cord, were 2 bound ledger volumes and a leather folder thick with folded papers. The cedar case had not warped. The oilcloth had not let moisture through. Someone had prepared these objects for a long storage or a hard journey, or both, and had done it with care. She noted that before she touched anything else. She lifted the cedar case first. It was lighter than it looked. Inside, nested in a felt-lined tray, were glass plate photographic negatives in individual paper sleeves. Each sleeve, labeled in a hand, she did not recognize, with dates spanning from January 1883, the same 18 months her father had identified in the transfer register. She held one plate up to the morning sky and looked through the glass. The negative image was crisp. A ledger page, columns and figures, handwritten entries in neat rows. The photographic emulsion had preserved it perfectly in the dry, sealed dark. Someone had photographed the transfer register before altering it. Page by page, month by month, through 18 months of fraudulent entries, so that the original record would exist somewhere, even after the ledger was corrected. Someone had known what Hollis Vane intended, and had hidden the original record where Vane's men would not think to look for it, inside the very vault they were burying. She sat down on the vault's threshold and held the cedar case in her lap and looked out across the flat in the early morning light. The desert was still. A hawk moved along the ridge. The same hawk, or its descendant. She thought that her father had stood at this spot, had felt the soil give slightly under his boot, had noted the compass bearing in his notebook in a harder hand than usual. He had been 8 inches and 3 years away from this threshold. The question he had spent his last months asking had an answer now, and the answer was that Vane had not been working alone, and that someone inside the operation had known the examination was coming and had decided, at some cost she could not yet calculate, to ensure the evidence survived it. had put it inside the very object Vane had chosen to conceal. She did not know who. She did not need to know. The record was here, and it was legible, and it said exactly what her father had believed it said, and the person who had made it retrievable had known she, or someone like her, would come. When she could stand again, she carried the oilcloth bundle from the vault and set it in the wagon bed. The ledger volumes contained the original transfer register for the Meridian Land and Trust Company, intact and unaltered, spanning 18 months of entries. The leather folder contained a second document she had not expected, a letter, unsigned but dated the 1st of November, 1884, addressed to Edmund Cole by name, care of the Yuma Territorial Land Office. It named 3 mining cooperatives. It named Hollis Vane. It named the routing account and the subsidiary and the approximate sum. It said, simply, that a man in possession of the evidence had grown afraid and had put the evidence where the evidence would survive him, and that he hoped someone would come for it. Her father had gone to find the vault before the letter reached him. He had nearly found it. He had died 12 miles away from it on a desert road in October. Marin folded the letter and placed it back in the folder. If you have wondered, as I have, what it costs a person to find the proof they have spent years looking for, know that it does not feel like winning. It feels like the weight of something finally set down. She drove the wagon back to the road and did not look behind her at the open vault in the pale flat desert. She found Nettie Sosa and Yuma in a rooming house on the main street, where the old postmistress of Aldrin Flat had lived since the town's collapse. Nettie was 72, with a face like the Sandstone Ridge and a memory for names that had not dimmed in the decades since she stopped sorting mail. She had a pot of coffee on the small iron stove in her room, and she poured 2 cups without being asked, the way a woman pours coffee when she has been expecting company. She had known Edmund Cole. She had sorted his mail for the 6 weeks he spent at Aldrin Flat in the autumn of 1884, and she had liked him for the same reason. Everyone who worked around him came to like him eventually. He was more interested in accuracy than in winning, which was uncommon enough to be noticeable. She had considered him honest and dogged and somewhat impractical. She had heard he died on the road to Yuma and had believed, privately, that he had not been thrown from any horse. When Marin laid the ledger volumes on the table between them and named the 3 mining cooperatives, Nettie set down her cup and looked at the page Marin had opened to. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said without pause that she had posted quarterly reports for all 3 cooperatives to the Territorial Records Office and had never understood why Meridian was the only bank east of Yuma that handled their accounts. That the men who ran those cooperatives had been careful, practical men who had chosen Meridian because it was the nearest institution with a charter, not because they had any particular trust in it. That she had watched 3 sets of families arrive in Yuma after Meridian closed, asking where their money had gone, and that the Yuma Territorial Office had told them it had gone with the bank. She said something else. She said the treasurer of one of those cooperatives, a man named Obadiah Reyes, had died of a chest illness in the winter of 1885, months after watching the savings of 43 families vanish with Meridian's closure. He had not been old. He had been the kind of man who takes the failure of his responsibilities personally, and he had taken this one in the way that kills. His son, Augustin, still lived in Yuma. He worked in the freight yard. Marin went to find him the next morning. Augustin Reyes was 30 years old and built for the work he did, a compact and careful man who had his father's quality of attention and none of his willingness to absorb a wrong silently. He met Marin at the freight office door during a break from unloading and listened to her, standing in the street with his arms at his sides and the morning heat building around them. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he asked to see the transfer register, and she opened it on the freight office's counter, the only flat surface within reach. She turned to the page that corresponded to his father's cooperative account and set her finger beside the routing entry that diverted their deposits month by month across 18 months. He looked at it for a long time, his face still, his breathing level. Then he said, his voice quiet and without theater. He knew. He always said the figures could not have come out that way by accident. She waited. He asked what would happen next. She told him that she intended to carry the ledger volumes, the glass plate negatives, and Rufus Hatch's signed statement to the Territorial Land Office in Tucson. That she would file a formal report under her father's examiner registration, which had never been formally closed. That the glass plates were photographic records of the original transfer register made by someone inside the Meridian operation before the books were corrected, and that they constituted independent corroboration of every figure in the bound ledger before her. That the case against Hollis Vane was not a story told by the daughter of a dead bank examiner, but a physical documentary record in 3 independent forms, all of which said the same thing. Agustin Reyes looked at her for a moment. Then he said he would go to Tucson as well, if that was permitted, that he wanted to put his father's name on the record, that his father had not been wrong, and that he wanted someone to write that down where it could not be taken back. She said it was not only permitted but necessary. The ride to Tucson took 4 days. Marin drove the first 2 days alone through the desert basin, and then joined the main freight road that carried her into the higher desert and finally into Tucson's outskirts, where the mesquite grew thick along the arroyos, and the late summer light came in amber and long across the mountains to the east. Agustin Reyes rode the final 2 days alongside her, on a horse he had arranged in Yuma, and they did not speak much. There was nothing to negotiate. The record said what it said. She spent the journey reading and rereading the unsigned letter from the vault, trying to place the hand that had written it, and failing. The penmanship was plain, a working man's hand rather than a clerk's. The letters formed carefully but without practice. The paper was standard ledger stock, which told her nothing. She came to believe the author had been one of the men hired to bury the vault that night, someone who had understood what was being concealed and had decided at some point before the work was finished that he would not let it disappear entirely. He had placed the letter inside the vault because he could not send it safely, and because the vault was the one place it would be found only by the person willing to dig for it. She would never know his name. She let that rest. The Territorial Land Office in Tucson received the report on a Thursday morning in August. Marin carried the oilcloth bundle through the door herself and set it on the counter, and asked to file a bank examiner's report under Edmund Cole's registration number, which she had memorized from his documentation and which had never been formally closed because his death had been ruled an accident. The clerk who took the ledger volumes looked at them with the particular blankness of a man encountering something he did not have a category for, and carried them to a back room. He returned 15 minutes later with a supervisor who read the title page of the transfer register and then read Rufus Hatch's signed statement without expression. Then he sat down. He asked her how she had obtained the ledger volumes. She told him. He asked her if the glass plate negatives matched the ledger's contents. She said that they did, page for page, across 18 months, and that he was welcome to verify this himself with a magnifying glass, which she had brought. Agustin Reyes gave his statement in writing that afternoon, witnessed by the land office notary, identifying himself as the son of Obadiah Reyes, treasurer of the Mesa Copper Cooperative, and naming the account and the sum and the date the funds had been diverted. He wrote it in a careful hand and signed his name at the bottom, in a way that left no ambiguity about whether he intended to be found, if questioned. The revocation of Hollis Vane's banking charter was handled by the Territorial Commission in the weeks that followed, quietly and without public announcement. His land commissioner appointment was reviewed and declined for renewal when it came due in October. He did not contest either action. He left Tucson before the end of the year. He was not heard of afterward in the territory, and Marin did not seek information about where he went. A portion of the estate recoverable through the territorial process was distributed across the 3 cooperatives the following spring. It was not the full sum or anything near it. $40,000 moved through a subsidiary in a land company, and 3 years of further concealment does not come back intact through a government process. The Territorial Commission recovered $11,000, of which each cooperative received a share proportional to its documented loss. Agustin Reyes collected the sum on behalf of his father's cooperative and wrote Marin a short letter afterward, which she kept. He said that the money was less than the record, that having the record was what mattered, that his father had not been wrong about what happened to their deposits, and that now the territorial files said so, and that it could not be taken back. She believed him. She had believed, since the night she found her father's satchel in the land office storeroom, that the record was worth more than the money. Edmund Cole had believed the same thing. He had gone to find the evidence before filing his report, because without the physical record, his findings were an examiner's opinion against a land commissioner's word. He had died 12 miles from the vault, in October, on a desert road that was not safe for a man who had found what he had found. The record had waited for her. It had kept itself in the cedar case, in the dry dark, for 3 years. She returned to Aldrin Flat once more, alone, in September. The vault still stood open in the desert flat, its door ajar, the interior empty now, and filling slowly with blown grit. She looked at it for a while. It did not look frightening. It looked like what it was. A very heavy box that someone had believed would hold a secret forever, and had been wrong about. She set up her father's transit scope on the bank foundation for the last time, aiming it south-southwest at 41 degrees, the bearing he had recorded in his notebook 12 days before he died. She sighted through the eyepiece. The depression in the alkaline crust was still visible from this angle, even now, even with the vault removed. The soil there had settled differently, held a different light, red as subtly, permanently distinct from the flat around it. Her father had seen it from exactly this spot. She had followed his eye. In the years that followed, the Aldrin Flat parcel passed back through the territorial auction process and was purchased by a water rights company that found at depth below the vault excavation an aquifer they had not expected, and that changed the character of that part of the desert. Marin had known nothing of the water. She had not been looking for water. She had been looking for what was already there. The transit scope, a brass instrument with a worn leather grip on its carrying case and a small chip in the objective housing from some forgotten impact in its long working life, sat on her table in Yuma for the rest of her years. When the light was right in the late afternoon, it caught the sun through the window and threw a copper circle on the plaster wall, like the face of a compass pointing somewhere she had already been. She never left it behind when she traveled, and she carried it the way her father had always told her to carry a good instrument. Not because it was valuable, but because it was reliable, and in a landscape where everything else shifted, a reliable instrument was the only thing you could be sure of.